Uh, Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining today for a book conversation sponsored by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that's focused on China's Belt and Road Initiative. My name is Steve Feldstein. I'm a senior fellow in Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program, and I'm pleased to host our book conversation today with two distinguished guests, Jonathan Hillman and Dr. Sheena Greitens. Jonathan Hillman is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he's written a book, The Emperor's New Road, China and the Project of the Century, that examines the motivations and details behind Chinese President Xi Jinping's flagship $1 trillion development initiative. Today, he will walk us through the book's main findings and discuss its implications for U.S. foreign policy and geopolitics. A few words about John. So he is currently the director of the Reconnecting Asia project at CSIS, one of the most extensive open source databases tracking China's Belt and Road Initiative. Prior to joining CSIS, John served as a policy advisor at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where he contributed to the 2015 U.S. National Security Strategy and the President's trade agenda. He has also worked as a researcher at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, and in Kyrgyzstan as a Fulbright Scholar. I'm also delighted to welcome Dr. Sheena Greitens, an associate professor at the University of Texas's LBJ School and a fellow with University of Texas's Strauss Center and Clements Center on National Security. Her work focuses on East Asia, American national security, and authoritarian politics and foreign policy. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, an adjunct fellow with the Korea Chair at CSIS, an associate at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard, and part of the Digital Freedom Forum at the Center for a New American Security. Sheena published a book in 2016 entitled Dictators and Their Secret Police, Coercive Institutions and State Violence. She will serve as our respondent for today's event. At the outset, I wanted to offer a few observations about the Belt and Road Initiative and the policy context for US-China relations before turning it over to John. Our discussion comes at an important inflection point as we transition from the Trump administration to President-elect Joe Biden. Trump's foreign policy approach has attracted a lot of criticism for its reliance on force and unilateralism, its abandonment of alliances, and its seeming embrace of authoritarian leaders. But one aspect that many experts agree upon is that Trump's advisors have forced a hard conversation about China's intentions and whether past administrations, both Republican and Democratic, may have provided too much leeway to the Chinese government at the expense of US interests. At this juncture, we can expect that Biden's team will recalibrate US policy towards China and undergo a bigger rethink about how to run US national security. Undoubtedly, we can expect big shifts, but it also seems likely that Biden will adopt some key elements established by Trump's China policy, and that competition between the two powers is unlikely to ebb in the near future. Certainly, there's no indication that Chinese leadership is interested in backing away from continued competition, if not confrontation, with the United States, which is why John's book comes at an exceptionally important moment and can help us understand how the Belt and Road Initiative fits into China's geostrategic vision, what its implications are for competition between the US and its democratic allies in China, and how these issues are manifesting on the ground in small and big ways. I'll start by turning things over to John to provide an overview of key insights of the book. I'll then turn to Sheena for comments and response. And from there, we'll delve into a Q&A between the three of us. I encourage you to think about questions you'd like to pose to the panelists. With about 15 to 20 minutes remaining, I'll begin drawing directly from audience questions you posed using the chat function. So thanks again for joining, and let me turn it over to John to kick us off.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you also to the Carnegie Endowment for making the event possible today. Let me start by with just sharing a sort of short personal story about how this book came to be, and then I'll share some of the findings. I want obviously want people to read it, so I won't give you the full Cliff Notes version, and then briefly just conclude with a few thoughts about where I think this is headed. And plenty to dive into there. But so I've been at CSIS for 4 years now, studying China's Belt and Road Initiative, and really the core of the work is trying to track what's actually happening or sometimes not happening on the ground. And in 2017, I had an opportunity to attend the first Belt and Road Forum. Not because I'm all that important, but because someone who is very important couldn't go, and so I inherited their invitation and found myself in Beijing for this grand gathering, which included representatives from over 100 countries and international organizations. I think almost 24 world leaders, and it felt almost like a UN or a mini UN. And the United States was there, but in a much more subtle way. And so it felt, to me, almost like this alternative order that was emerging. It was very well orchestrated, and Xi Jinping spoke, Vladimir Putin spoke. It was very, very impressive. And I left that conference, left that forum, really thinking that this Belt and Road Initiative was something that was going to fundamentally change flows of commerce, and with it, politics, international politics. And I had scheduled a few project visits in the region after the conference, and it wasn't even before I had fully got out of the country that I started to question whether those initial impressions of this being hyper centralized, uber strategic, very well coordinated, whether those impressions were accurate. So my first stop after the conference was to go into Kyrgyzstan through a border crossing, so crossing from China to Kyrgyzstan. And this, as people know, it's very easy to cross borders on airplanes. It's a little bit more complicated sometimes to do it in cars or on foot. And in order to cross this border, I was surprised to find out that I had to go through about 7 checkpoints. And somewhere around checkpoint 4 or 5, the Chinese border guards took a lunch break. And it wasn't just a 30-minute lunch break. It was like a 3 or 4 hour or longer lunch break. So I'm sitting there, stuck between China and Kyrgyzstan, and I started to, question, how real everything I had just heard at this forum actually was. And I spent, writing this book, I spent, another 2 years going to projects, visited about 16 countries, and really trying to get a sense for, again, what's actually happening on the ground, or in some cases not happening. And in going to these places and seeing these projects, I also tried to I tried to look at the history of some of these places, because I think sometimes when we talk about China today, we talk about it in a vacuum, as if not only, certainly there are other countries pursuing large projects today beyond their borders. Japan, for example, outspending China in Southeast Asia. But China's not the first rising power to try to do large projects beyond its borders. And so one of the themes of this book, when I look at different regions, is the ways in which China is following in the footsteps of these great power predecessors. And in many cases, the Belt and Road is being advertised as this new innovative thing. But in many cases, China is really repeating the mistakes of countries that have gone before it. So just a few examples of that. I mentioned Japan and Southeast Asia. Japan's basically the incumbent in Southeast Asia, has been building large projects there for decades. And decades ago, many of the accusations that were leveled against Japan sound strikingly familiar today when we're talking about China. So in the 70s and 80s, when anxiety about Japan as this rising power potentially overtaking the United States was very high, you had members of U.S. Congress, saying Japan was using predatory economic practices. Japan was being accused, in some cases rightfully so, of using loans at interest rates that were too high, of structuring deals that favored its own companies, of using payouts to secure contracts. Japan learned from that experience, though. It went through a lot of some public embarrassments, including in the Philippines, and I think really learned from it and reformed its practices. It's unclear whether China, not being a democracy, not having a partner like the United States to sort of speak the tough truths to it, whether it has those same pressures to reform. But some strong echoes there in Southeast Asia. In Pakistan, China is actually following in the footsteps of the United States. It wasn't that long ago a little over a decade, when the United States was announcing that we were going to be spending significant amounts of money on large visible infrastructure projects in Pakistan as part of our strategy to bring stability to Afghanistan. Some of those projects that the United States passed on are now Belt and Road projects. And some of the projects the United States passed on well before that, to include Gwadar Port, are now flagship Belt and Road projects. And so again, some parallels there. There, Steve, as you know, there are parallels in East Africa as well, in Ethiopia, Kenya, where European powers went and built large projects. And so I think as the book tries to use history basically as a yardstick for, sizing up China's activities, seeing in what ways they're similar to what we've seen before and what ways they're different. And I'm struck, in place after place and region after region, I'm struck by the fact that China faces, I think, an even greater set of challenges to exercising power as this outside actor. If you imagine, for example, the British building a rail project in Kenya 100 years ago, they didn't need to put up with, local civil society groups, and they didn't, they didn't have to work through court systems. They didn't have to worry about journalists and people with cell phone cameras. They didn't have international standards to compare their activities to. There was no World Bank. And so I think that the bar for success is higher, as it should be. And in fact, I think as China has been going to these places and making mistakes, it's been learning too. It's been learning. This has not been a static initiative. The Belt and Road, as it was announced in 2013, was not the same as it was in 2017 when I went to the Belt and Road Forum, and certainly not the same as it is today. And I think you can see the limits in this grand initiative as the levels of project activity have been pulled back even before the pandemic. And I think the pandemic in some ways has exacerbated some of the underlying conditions of the Belt and Road. A willingness to do big projects in risky markets with a lack of transparency. And I think we're seeing this now as many countries go to the IMF for debt relief. And this is something that I think was going to continue to play out in the months to come. And yet, I think it is premature, even despite all those challenges, it's premature to write off this grand vision as, having outright failed and having, I don't expect it to recede, because this is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy vision. It's enshrined in the Communist Party constitution. And I think even if Xi Jinping were to leave, which no one is expecting, I think you would still have an interest among some pretty powerful interest groups within China, and certainly a need outside of China for these large projects. So I think as long as China has the will and the wallet to do these types of activities, it will continue to do that. But there's also an opportunity today, I think, as these levels of project activity come down, with a new U.S. administration coming in January. I do think that there's an opportunity to try to mitigate more of the risks, along the Belt and Road, to provide better alternatives, and to help China learn from not only its own experience here, but also the experience of other countries. So let me leave it there, and thank you again for having me and the opportunity to discuss these issues.
Great. Thank you, John. I think it was a really nice exposition and framing of the issues that we'll discuss. And I want to really commend you. I was so impressed by the extensive amount of field work that went into this project. You can really tell that this is the culmination of many thousands of miles of travel and interviews and so forth. And when you mentioned the border, the different borders and how that made an impression on you, I'm not going to give away your book. I encourage everyone here to buy it as quickly as you can. But it really made me think of your chapter on Russia and your experience there in terms of the obstacles and the sometimes even scary moments you had in terms of trying to go between two countries, Russia and China, that ostensibly are allies and are trying to come closer together as a result of Belt and Road. So I won't give anything else further away about that chapter, but it really struck me. Let me turn it over to Sheena for your comments.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, I would second that. I found that, the book is a great read, and it's particularly valuable in a couple of areas. And so I wanted to highlight about 4 of those, and then ask you maybe 1 or 2 questions about the book and about your thoughts on things that came up in the book or that came up as I was reading, but that I wanted to know a little bit more about. First of all, I think that the ground level focus of the book is really helpful for us, because we often view BRI at the 30,000 foot level. Right? We often view it in terms of economic statistics, big numbers, particular projects, but getting that granularity of what it feels like to actually walk around a project, or go into the video command center of a particular port, I thought was a really, really helpful complement to the more abstract or macro perspectives that we often get on BRI. And I know that kind of global field work is hard to do, and it can be hard to put the pieces together from seeing different places at different times. So I really think that perspective is a valuable addition to the discussion. I also really appreciated the way that you framed the book as a book about China outside of China, right? And thinking about China's role in the world. I will come back to that because I have at least 1 question about that. But I think this idea of China as a global player and simply looking at it from the outside in is again a really, really helpful way to talk about BRI. The 3rd thing that I thought was valuable, I really enjoyed the discussion about infrastructure and telegraph lines and things like that in the colonial days of yore. I mean, having read a lot about different colonial powers and their approaches to their colonial projects and their imperial vision, and then the reality on the ground. I thought it was really helpful to have that comparative reminder to give us that baseline of what's new, what's not, what is sort of the historical norm, where have the standards for great power involvement in the international community changed over the course of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Right. And so I think that sense of, why infrastructure, the role that it's typically played in great power, global presence is also, probably the 3rd contribution, where I think the book is really, really helpful and gives us a sense of, these echoes of the past where history rhymes, if not repeats. And then I think, probably the other theme that really struck me about the book was this balance between connectivity and control that you bring up, that China is trying to connect itself to the outside world, but at the same time is really preoccupied with not losing control. And the historical chapter talks about going back to the days of roads and river operations and foreign ports during the century of humiliation and that era. That infrastructure was considered a threat to internal security and to internal stability, potentially destabilizing. And so I thought that that idea of connectivity versus control for me was a really useful way to think about the paradox of BRI, because it is both a project to connect China to the outside world, but also something that where those points of connection and interface then have to be carefully watched. And one of the big internal developments under Xi Jinping has been the construction of a framework for national security that explicitly views the internal and the external as closely connected, and these potential threats as mutually interlocking. And so I found the repeated revisiting of that idea throughout the book really fascinating. So I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you just to start the discussion off that the book made me think about. And I wanted to get your take on it. There's been a lot of discussion in the news the past few days about RCEP and regional integration within the Asia Pacific, right? Making the point that the US and India now are kind of outside these integration projects. I wanted to ask you about how you see the push for connectivity come as, in terms of being driven by China and being driven by regional demand. One of the things that I think your book really nicely highlights is the complexity of the demand side story in these different places where BRI is operating. So I wanted to just ask you to speculate a little bit, and you do talk about this in your chapter in Southeast Asia. Some of the push for connectivity isn't just coming from China, right? It's coming from elsewhere in Asia, including Japan. And so how you see these different forces that are all pushing toward connectivity, but maybe at different nodes and in different places of emphasis. If you could just kind of place China for us and talk about how you see that playing out, especially going forward. One of the places I work on is the Philippines. I know Steve has done some deep digging into that as well. And, Duterte has really, courted Chinese infrastructure investment and infrastructure projects, but the projects, as you described so well in the book, have been pretty slow to get off the ground, right? Things that exist in paper haven't actually broken ground yet. Whereas Japan had older infrastructure commitments, but has continued to make steady progress. And I wanted to just think about how that delta could play out. Right? How, if China overpromises, but then things are slow and the timelines don't account for inevitable delays, whereas Japan sort of, maybe doesn't have this big BRI, catchphrase, the attention grabbing headlines in terms of number of projects and dollar amounts, but continues to make steady contributions. How does that affect the global perceptions of BRI and perceptions in some of these critical demand side countries where there are multiple infrastructure sources of infrastructure supply? And then I guess I had another question about this demand side issue, because again, like I said, I found, having a global survey of these different demand side dynamics in different parts of the world, I thought was one of the great things, one of the things I really appreciated as I read the book. But recipient countries they have politics of their own, right? And so, in the Philippines, Duterte has been the one courting Chinese infrastructure investment, but civil society, especially on things like Huawei, digital infrastructure, safe city projects, right? Civil society and the Philippine legislature have been much more skeptical, much more cautious, and in some cases have really pushed back, right? And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about, the domestic politics in these countries and how BRI might play out as different countries undergo their own political transitions, change in presidencies, or alignments in parliament or the legislature, and how that might play out. Then I guess the third thing, which is related to that, was just to ask you a little bit more. You described China's BRI operations as pretty fragmented. Right? And we know there are tons of actors in China who are participating in these different BRI projects. But to just ask you, how you see that jumble is too negative a word, right? But this array of sometimes overlapping, sometimes coordinated, but sometimes very fragmented organizations that originate from China, right? Companies, SOEs, the banks, the various ministries that are involved, which you describe really nicely, that the roles of about 4 or 5 different ministries in China. And so, how does that, what challenge does that pose, whether it's for US allies, but also for the United States? In some ways, a strategy is easier to anticipate and react to if it's coherent. And so, if you're thinking about the Biden administration and trying to give them advice, how does the fact that it is so fragmented affect the advice that you might give them on, understanding the different places China's operating, but also how many, the sheer multiplicity of actors in the Chinese space that are involved in activities that are all grouped under this Belt and Road Initiative heading or slogan? So those were my main questions in reading this. Again, you do touch on all of them in the book, but these are areas that, because they're in the news, because we're at this inflection moment that Steve described, I wanted to ask you how you would think about those three things in particular, given, the inflection point and the potential for American policy to kind of reorient itself a bit right now. So that's it, but really enjoyed the book. I have my copy here. It's great. Really enjoyed reading it, and just I'm delighted to be able to discuss and follow up with you on it, because it's a great read. So thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks so much, Sheena. I think really insightful comments and really good questions. And I think that actually might be a good starting point for our conversation. John, if you want to address some of the questions Sheena posed, either all of them and kind of more broadly, or one or two of them more specifically. Let me turn it back over to you, and then we can kind of go from there.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Sheena. Really appreciate it. And I've benefited from your work, especially on some of the digital infrastructure and these issues of control, as you mentioned, which I think are likely to become even more salient in a sort of a smaller but more high tech, Belt and Road 2.0. So your question about demand, I think, really is critical, because so first, just from a historical perspective, Belt and Road, not the first connectivity vision for Asia, and not even the first one in recent history to have the word Silk, or the word Silk Road attached to it, right? The United States had its own Silk Road effort, again, sort of around the AFPAC strategy about a decade ago. But we can go much further back to the United Nations and really ambitious plans that the UN put out in the late 50s, early 60s for Pan-Asian networks of roads and rail projects. Some of which are still sort of moving forward, but under the Belt and Road banner. And I think the demand part is so important, because even despite some of the missteps and mistakes, and the fact that the Belt and Road brand in some places become a little bit toxic, that existing demand, and the fact that even China alone, in the sort of most wildly exaggerated versions of what Belt and Road could involve in terms of financing, is going to come nowhere close to meeting the region's needs. So, according to the Asian Development Bank, developing Asia alone needs about $26 trillion of investment in infrastructure. I think that was between 2016 and 2030. And so, China is only going to be able to, contribute a part of that. But that gives this some resiliency. And so it's been interesting to see, in some places, leaders will campaign for office against the Belt and Road, but then what do they do when they get into office? They still have, only so many options. And in fact, I think it's to their advantage to try to cultivate options and to create competition among outside investors. I think a former finance minister from Indonesia put it very clearly once and said, speaking about the competition between Japan and China, said, this is a good competition for us. We welcome this competition, and I think that's true as long as it happens. There's the potential for so much to go wrong when it happens in places with low levels of where the institutions aren't ready to handle that competition, and because these large infrastructure projects are basically tailor-made for corruption. I mean, that's a universal challenge. It's not just a China challenge, but transportation, construction, and the extractive industries are just globally prone to corruption. And I think where China fits in on the spectrum of these competing offers is, the China model here has some advantages to it if you put yourself in the shoes of someone who's considering what your options are. I mean, in some cases, the best strength of the China approach is it is the only option on the table, because you've taken a proposal for something to others and they've declined it. And so that's the story of projects like Hambantota Port, which were floated to the Asian Development Bank and others before China was ready to provide support. There's also, I think, the China approach to projects here also really has a speed advantage. And so, the opacity of the process, I think, it pushes risk further into the project process. And there's not a lot of time, or there's not as much time spent doing things like environmental and social impact standards assessments up front, as the World Bank or others would do. And I think that's appealing to leaders with a political timeline. You've got re-election in a year or two, and you would certainly prefer to be able to announce a project sooner. And the transparency issue, it takes both sides, frankly, to decide to keep details outside the public eye, and that often benefits not just Chinese actors, but actors on the recipient side. Domestic politics are so important because I guess I think of every project as a negotiation. Yes, you can say it's all part of the same overarching initiative, but every project really is a negotiation, and it's a negotiation between a set of actors in the recipient country and a set of actors on the Chinese side. And so you can't have projects like the port in Hambantota without both a willingness on China's side to finance it, as well as a domestic political patron. Really, in the Hambantota gets way too much attention, probably, but we kind of have to talk about it now because so many people have brought it up. But what a lot of people don't know is that the very first feasibility study for that port was financed by the Canadian government, and at the time, the Sri Lankan government decided to reject the project proposal. There was a Canadian contractor who was very excited about doing it because contractors like to build stuff. So it had no domestic political patron, and it had no source of international financing. And so both of those things needed to be in place in order for the project to happen. And so I do think that the demand and domestic politics will give the Belt and Road resiliency, even despite these missteps. And so I'm happy to talk more about the fragmentation point too, which I think is fascinating. I think, frankly, one of the most underappreciated dimensions of this, because again, I think, myself included, several years ago, when I think national security and sort of, grand strategy types look at this, it looks much more coherent than it actually is on the ground. But happy to dive into that more.
Great. Thank you. Well, let me follow up a little bit on the fragmentation point in a slightly different way, and I'd love to hear responses back from both of you. But my question is, there is I think a criticism or perception by certain countries when it comes to the development activities that the United States or others advance, that they come with very strong strings attached, and oftentimes with political implications, right? So whether it's a Millennium Challenge Corporation project or USA project, there oftentimes are governance requirements that are necessary, corruption requirements, but things that really delve into the political. And one of the perceptions is that with BRI, there's a bit of there's more of a non-interference strategy associated with projects, where, there isn't necessarily a need for certain types of governance or other requirements to be filled in order for the project to continue. Now, to me, that sounds a little bit like an oversimplification, and that it probably, the political strings probably vary by country, and that some of them we just don't know about, but it doesn't mean that there isn't influence that the Chinese or expectations that the Chinese have as a result of going ahead with projects. But I'm curious to kind of hear both your perceptions on this issue.
I mean, I can offer some initial thoughts, but I'd really like to know what John thinks about this. I think it varies again by project, right? So this is why this on the ground view, where you get a sense of the variation in texture from project to project is so important, right? In some cases, there are places where China's development, finance, and development work, like the ADB, mostly so far has partnered with other development bodies and stuck to their standards. But again, that's a pretty small proportion of China's development activity. And I think one of the risks is this doesn't have to happen very often for it to send quite a strong signal, is that, there are cases in which China has used economic leverage previously, in order to try to get a country in Asia to toe a certain security line. And so I'm thinking particularly of the THAAD debate in South Korea, and the economic consequences that were applied to South Korea. Infrastructure is a lot more sunk cost for China, but also a lot more sunk cost for the recipient country. And so, a place like the Philippines, I think part of the reason you get some wariness is that there's, a similar thing played out in the Philippines after the Scarborough Shoal incident in 2012. And so the idea that, something as central to governance as infrastructure might become a political tool, or a tool of political leverage, I think is enough to make a number of countries nervous. I don't know if that quite gets to your question, but I think that, again, I'm trying there's this phrase in Chinese, right? Kill the chicken to scare the monkey, right? Some of these lessons from non-infrastructure economic cases where trade has been used to try to achieve political or security objectives, can still create wariness in recipient countries on these infrastructure projects and on over-dependence on China. The other part of it is, right, if the World Bank and Japan have kind of picked projects where countries are going to be willing to be compatible with these standards, then what's left is a mix of the remaining work to be done, right? John noted that there's more work on infrastructure in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific to be done than even China, can fill the gap on. But those are going to be more predominantly projects where there might be issues with transparency or some other problem with the project itself, that made them less appealing, or that made the World Bank or one of these other multilateral institutions, Japan, United States, USAID, take a pass, right? So that's the reality also of being a late arriver to the great power development assistance game, is that there's a certain set of projects that have already been taken off the table, and that doesn't in any way suggest that China's, in some cases, willingness not to adhere to those standards is okay. It's the reality of the set of choices that they're making about where to provide assistance. But I think we also shouldn't, I guess the last point I'd make is that framing it as non-interference doesn't quite work for me, because you still are providing infrastructure under a certain incumbent to a certain set of actors. It's going to have political effects. The idea that this is just somehow going to be apolitical just doesn't make sense, right? Non-interference would be not getting involved at all. It's, it might not be sort of overt partisanship, but to argue that it doesn't have significant political effects just flies in the face of a lot of what we know about development and the development politics nexus in the last, 100 years, maybe longer. John tells me history is deeper than that. So those are my thoughts.
Great, John.
I think Sheena makes a great point about, non-interference really would be not getting involved. And also that China is operating in places where most people have, most of the other options have said, we see a little bit too much risk here, or, the participating governments might not be willing to sign up to the standards that, a multilateral development bank might accept. And also, this idea too that, so China's both a latecomer to this, but also the longer the Belt and Road goes on, imagine what the world of sort of infrastructure project options looked like in 2013 when this was formally announced. A lot of that has been picked through, right? And it turns out that some of the low-hanging fruit was also rotten. And so I think this just becomes, it doesn't get easier as you move it forward. I would say that there are strings attached, but there are different strings. And so, the strings that are not attached are, sometimes standards that would take a project longer. And so there's often flexibility, and that, again, flexibility and speed is one of those real, strengths on the Chinese side here. There was a Central Asian official who told me once that, they knew that they were going to do this road project financed and built by Chinese companies, that they would have to rebuild it in 15 years. But that was their only road option, basically. And so they went ahead and they did it. And he said that they did it because, in large part because, the Chinese were willing to work with the budget that, they had. So rather than saying, actually you need more money to do this sort of higher quality project, they, in that case, ostensibly were willing to just get it done at a lower quality, which for that, apparently for that government at the time was preferable to doing no road project, or to borrowing more and doing a more expensive one. The strings that are attached, though, are things like, you're required to use Chinese contractors, and, if you take financing. And so I think that has sort of been at odds a little bit with the rhetoric about the Belt and Road being win-win. Yes, there are subcontracting opportunities, but the lion's share of contracts are going to Chinese state-owned enterprises, not local companies in the recipient countries. In some cases, there are also requirements in the contracts that advantage China if disputes happen. Disputes need to be settled in Chinese courts, for example. There's now a case in Hungary where the details around Hungary too, right? By the way, member of the EU, not a developing economy, has classified the details around a large project that it's doing, because it said that was a requirement of the financing, the Chinese financing that came with the project. The project is also, the consortium that is doing the project involves a close friend of the leader of Hungary, close childhood friend of his, and a Chinese company. And so, these are I think those are strings. And then they're informal. They're sort of more things that wouldn't be written down in a document, that China would like to have support on political issues. I think, again, you've seen that in Hungary and Greece. You've seen them weaken common EU statements against China, and it's been interesting this year. And as the sort of in the early stages of the pandemic, there was almost a Belt and Road echo chamber. China was able to get these statements from countries who are big participants in the Belt and Road, statements supporting China's response to the pandemic, which it urgently wanted. So Serbia and Ethiopia and Pakistan, and it's like all of a sudden you have this global chorus praising your response. And so, not a formal string, but definitely an avenue for influence there as well.
Yeah, thank you. Interestingly, there seems to have been more recently, at least from the EU, more pushback against the Chinese and against the Belt and Road. So we'll see where things go. Sort of an open question. I want to turn to one of the questions that the audience posed, and to sort of see what your perspective is. So one of the members asked, African leaders have voiced concerns about getting pulled into a great power conflict between the US and China. Is a great power conflict a constructive or counterproductive framework for the US interactions with African leadership? Any thoughts on that? It's a little more specific to the region, but maybe you could think about that even more broadly towards other regions as well, in terms of that being a modality, particularly as it relates to how the incoming administration might approach Belt and Road and these geostrategic questions. We can start with we'll go to Sheena and then John.
Okay, I was trying to defer to John since today is his show. I'd be wary of the great power competition framing in a lot of the world, to be honest. I think it's a helpful orientation for coordination in the United States government But I think there's at least one major risk, maybe 1.5. Let me talk about the half first, which is not so much, it's something that actually emerges from Central Asia, right? Where there was this phrase, the Great Game, right? The scramble for Central Asia by colonial powers and there was also, the so-called scramble for Africa. And so I think, in a lot of places, especially places where the state was born out of a decolonization process, there's a natural wariness of something that looks like great power, semi-colonial, dividing up the world or competing over the world. And the reality is that a lot of places, particularly in East Asia, right? Africa is probably a bit more varied, a bit more mixed, just because the number of countries involved is higher and there's more variation. But a lot of places have strong economic ties to China, may have security and economic ties with the United States that are structured in such a way that a wholesale all or nothing choice between the two sides is not a helpful way for that country to think about its own challenges. And one of my concerns about the United States and the way the United States has approached, in particular, the issue that Steve, both you and I have looked a lot at about digital surveillance and surveillance technology, is that I actually think our quote unquote China policy would be more effective if we talk less about China and much more about the actual countries in which these developments are taking place. And I know that digital surveillance is not quite the same as the Belt and Road. There's the digital Silk Road idea so there's the Venn diagram, the Venn circles overlap in the diagram. But I think that the United States needs to be really wary that we don't go to other places in the world and talk more about China than we do about the place where we're standing and having the conversation. Right? I think the best partnerships, the United States, one of the real strengths of the United States is its network of allies and partners. And that to have a strong partnership, we need to take seriously the interests of those partners in their own right, and not just sort of instrumentalize them as a tool of US-China competition. I think that's too reactive, and I think it's less likely to be successful. So while I think, the United States needs to get its strategic house in order and get clear priorities and a coordinated plan of action within the USG, I think there are some real risks in transferring that messaging. I'm not sure it's necessary internally, but I also see some risks in terms of our diplomacy, our communication, and our messaging abroad. So there's kind of a separate question of, is that what is taking place? To some extent, yes. But is that the most helpful way to frame it in terms of when we go out and talk to the countries around the world about what we're trying to accomplish? My strong instinct there would be no. I'm willing to wait for more data and to see the case against that. But my experience so far has been that can really trip us up if we're not talking to our partners about their interests and the shared interests we have with them, which sometimes involve China and sometimes are about very, very different things.
Great. John.
I love that Sheena pointed out too, wouldn't it be nice if we looked at some data too about, the sort of reactions that some of the, public diplomacy from the US side, sort of, how is it actually being received in some of these recipient countries? I'm not sure the government has done that. And I'm not sure that they would be happy with some of the results if they were to, ask audiences, would you prefer that, we spend our time talking about China or what your needs are, So I totally agree that if there's senior US officials in Africa, they should be there because Africa matters, not because of, some threat posed by China. I think a lot of the public diplomacy abroad, unfortunately, it's been sounding like it's for a domestic audience and sort of a niche domestic audience. So I do think that there is a lot of room for improvement there, and just to try to, the other challenge with great power competition as a rhetorical device abroad is, the decision makers who are deciding whether to do projects here care about things like, to put it into context with some of the work that both of you have done on smart cities and surveillance, and we're talking about, elected officials who care about things like traffic and crime and waste disposal in their cities. They're not really thinking about great power competition. They're thinking about jobs and education. And so I think the more that the U.S. can really get in the mindset of providing practical alternatives that really speak to the more immediate needs and aspirations of these countries, I think that's going to be much more effective. And to do a better job of not just condemning the risks and flaws of what someone else is doing, which it's fine to do some of that, to point out the risks, but to talk about the benefits of what it is that we're offering. I think, if you go to buy a car, right, you go to a Ford dealership, they don't spend the entire time telling you about how horrible Toyota is. They sell you on the benefits of the car they're trying to sell you. So I agree really, and do think that that's something where that there is an opportunity to do better in that area.
Thanks, John. No, I tend to agree as well. I haven't done a full scale study along the lines of what Sheena has mentioned. I think something like that would be very valuable. But anecdotally, in terms of reactions that I've witnessed and heard from government officials when senior USG leadership has come into town and talked about, the threat from China and why X or Y country needs to stick with the United States because otherwise, these security threats will emerge. I found that message is really isn't very convincing, and that in fact engenders some pushback where countries say, I don't want to get in between your squabbles. That great power conflict, leave that to great powers. We're just trying to find a way to move our country along, to be able to develop and to do these different things, and we don't want to get caught in the middle of this type of competition. So I think there's a lot of merit to what both of you have mentioned. I know we're running low on time, and I want to sort of finish off by asking both of you, based on what we've talked about and what we understand when it comes to BRI, what are the implications for a Biden administration as they start to think about, ways to strategically counter, to understand, to think about what BRI means in relation to U.S. policy going forward? We can, I'll turn first to Sheena, and I'll give it to John to kind of offer his thoughts and also wrap up with the book. How about that?
Sounds great. I think that this is going to be a central challenge for the Biden administration, in part because it's been defined that way by the Trump administration, right? And so any departure from that as the Biden administration prepares to write a national security strategy, right? We know that these national security strategies do look quite different. I just taught a class where I had my students go back and read President Bush's, President Obama's, and then the Trump administration 2017 national security strategy, and they're quite different, right? They express different priorities. And so I think, I'll be looking for how the Biden administration defines its priorities and articulates where China fits in those. And I don't have a crystal ball on that. I haven't talked to people involved with the transition about where their thinking is at. So I think that's a major thing to look for. I guess that, one specific decision that I'd expect them to confront, or challenge I'd expect them to confront, was that, I saw that one of the folks watching asked a question about the regional comprehensive economic partnership. And since I mentioned that at the very beginning, I wanted to just touch on that briefly. Right, the United States has for the last couple of years been in this business of looking at bilateral trade deals. And I think that the United States is going to have to grapple with the fact that economic integration at a multilateral level has been occurring, and trade integration has been, has progressed for the last couple of years, with the United States kind of largely on the outside, pursuing a more sort of hub and spokes trade strategy. And so again, I think one key question for the Obama administration, I don't think I can predict where they're going to go, but I think how they deal with an environment in which the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership has now been signed with the United States on the outside of it, is going to be a really important question for the economic dimensions of engagement with Asia. And is going to, could be a very consequential decision for how the United States sits compared to China, whether it's infrastructure or trade or just its overall economic presence and shared interests with countries in the region. So I think that's a key choice. Those are the two things that I'll be kind of watching and looking for in the next few months. But I want to know what John thinks, because he's written this whole book, and a lot has changed in 2020. So I'd love to know what he thinks, where he thinks we're headed. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Well, over to you, John, for your prognostications and what we can expect in 2021 with the Biden administration, and your kind of closing thoughts in general on BRI as we wrap up.
So I think one of the main areas to focus on here is probably a shift from a sort of a shift from away from a sort of zero-sum mindset toward an emphasis on how do we make the United States competitive, right? And so I do think that there's going to be a whole bunch of domestic initiatives that are very important to that longer term competition with China, and in the infrastructure space, just to mention one, I think the United States could use a little bit of spending and improvement of its own infrastructure, right? And so there's, I think, an opportunity to draw attention to what China's doing, but to channel that anxiety about what China's doing toward more productive ends. So it is a little bit embarrassing, honestly, that China has now rolled out a larger infrastructure package beyond its borders than the current administration has been able to do over the last 4 years, right? It hasn't been able to get Congress to sign up to do an infrastructure push. Something like that would be important, I think, for this longer term competition that we're entering. And I think it would send a positive signal, to the world too, that the U.S. is getting its own, it's strengthening its own domestic foundations. And there's clearly going to be an emphasis, I think, on more cooperation with partners and allies. And I understand some people are skeptical about that. They say, "Oh, it sounds great," but then what happens when you actually drill down to the details? This is actually an area, the sort of offering alternatives to Belt and Road, where some of the substance I actually think will bring the U.S. and its allies and partners closer together. One of the recent, I think, positive initiatives to come out of the U.S. government is called the Blue Dot Network, which is a partnership among the United States, Australia, and Japan to basically certify projects to say, these meet an agreed upon level of quality. It's been very difficult to operationalize that, and it's been difficult to attract additional partners to participate in it, especially from Europe, because the United States has been on a different page in terms of its stance on environmental issues. And so I do think, with the new administration, that space between the U.S. and European partners and allies will close. I think there'll be a little bit more convergence there, and that'll have a practical impact on being able to collaborate on infrastructure projects overseas. And then finally is, the issue we were talking about earlier. There's opportunities to improve, I think, some of the public diplomacy around how we talk about Belt and Road projects. And this shift has sort of already been happening for the last year and a half, but I think it'll happen even more, is to move toward talking more about what the United States supports and not just what we're against. We spent about 2 years criticizing Belt and Road projects without really saying what it is we support. That's why efforts like Japan's Quality Infrastructure Initiative are smart and strategic, because they're saying, here's what we're in favor of. And if Chinese projects meet those standards, we shouldn't be, we shouldn't be alarmed by them. So let's challenge China to, up its game. Let's compete, and let's talk about it, more confidently. So I think those are all areas for improvement. And I do believe too, the work that both of you are doing on digital issues is going to, be more of an issue along the Belt and Road. As again, we're looking at, I think, a smaller but more high-tech version of this going forward.
Great. Thank you, John. Well, I would just also add that a key part of what I hope will formulate and influence how the Biden administration thinks about the Belt and Road Initiative will be to also understand the nuances behind how the BRI works and how it's operating in different countries. And I think a great starting point for that is your book. So let's hope that some of the decision makers, if they haven't read your book already, will pick it up. And I'd certainly recommend it very strongly for the rest of you all. I want to thank John and Sheena for participating today and for your thoughtful comments and insights. There's so many other questions I have that we didn't have a chance to get into, but I do hope in the new year that we'll be able to tackle some of these and see how they evolve. In the meantime, thank you again for your time, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Over to you, Marissa.